Good morning, everybody. My name is Prac. We are doing block session 4, and we are going to cover risk management. This is session 1, risk management, chapters 1, 2, and 3. And I will start right now with chapter 1, principles of risk management. Okay. Right. What is risk? What do we understand by risk, right? Risk exists wherever the future is unknown. So, with reference to property management, if there's a lack of predictability, there's a risk attached to that lack of predictability. That is essentially what it is, right? The term risk can mean many different things, right? I want you to know these 5 things. The five different ways property management is exposed to risk is possibility of a loss, the chance that a loss will occur, the peril, like a fire, for example, that might cause a loss, the variation in possible loss, I'll go through each one of these now, and then the uncertainty concerning a loss. Right? So while there's no universally accepted definition of risk, it just simply means a variation in possible outcomes. So as a property manager, you expect certain things to happen in a certain way. If that does not occur, you are exposed to risk. Right? Right, so here we go. What is the possibility? So those 5 points that I need you to know, we'll elaborate on it here. Probability of loss, what is that? It is the relative likelihood that a loss will occur, right? So it basically varies between 1 and 0. 1 is obviously complete likelihood that a loss will occur, and then it's based on a probability distribution. But you just need to understand what the definitions are, right? The probability is the likelihood that the loss will occur. So if you envision that the loss might occur, there's a risk there that you need to control, right? And then the risk is also the variation in losses that can occur over a specific period. So if you take, for example, stock control, if you've got a warehouse with stock inside, you can either lose 10% of your stock or you can lose 50% of your stock depending on the situation, right? And then risk is inversely related to the ability to predict future loss experience. So the higher the unpredictability, the greater the risk. If you envision a stable situation going forward, then your risk is lower, right? Uncertainty is the perception of a person of a risk in a given situation. So again, if you're uncertain, there's a risk attached to that, right? And then I want you to differentiate between the following 2 losses: pure risk and speculative risk. Pure risk exists when there's a chance of loss, a chance of a gain as well. Sorry, I'm here. Pure risk exists when there's a chance of a loss but no chance of a gain. Like a motor car accident, they use that as an example. A fire in a building would be a pure risk because there's nothing that can be gained from it, right? A fire is, you can only expect damage and you can only expect a loss to occur. With a speculative risk, if you take gambling as an example, right? It's a speculative risk. Something good can come out of it and something bad can come out of it, but there's no way of knowing upfront, right? And they use the example of development of a new building, right? The building can either be a successful development or it can be a total failure, but there is, either way there's a possibility, right? So you must know the difference between a pure risk and a speculative risk, right? Now, there are a few different kinds of risks, right? Let's go through it, right? Property owners and property managers face many risks. And then the 5 different kinds of risks that you get. You get natural disasters. Again, you can't predict that at all. You can't control it. You can't, you can take steps to mitigate the risk, but that's about it. Natural disasters, fire, political acts, failure in building, like a mechanical failure or a structural failure in a building, and environmental risks, right? So you need to know those 5 different risks, right? Then we move on to economic risk. What is an economic risk? Each one of the physical risks may have an economic impact, right? So you get an initial impact, and then you got consequential impact, right? So the initial impact is, obviously you can understand, it's the first stage of that exposure to the risk, right? So increased in design or construction costs, those are all in the beginning stages of, let's say, building development as an example. And then you get consequential impacts, such as direct or indirect. You also need to know the difference between the two, and an example of what would be a consequential impact, right? And then the economic cost of risk relates both to the losses which do occur and the cost of uncertainty, even if the losses do not occur, right? So they give the example of the cost of fear and worry, right? Perhaps let's use the example of you don't know if there's going to be a student vandalism or student strike, but you still need to put security in place. So whether or not it does occur, there is a cost associated with whether or not the risk actually happened. Does that make sense? It's almost a cost that you have to take, and you cannot avoid that cost. In fact, it's best to not avoid that cost, right? And then a distortion in production and price structures, right? Such as misallocation of funds. Perhaps you put too much cost into one section where it actually was needed in another. Shortening of time horizons and extreme risk avoidance and actions. There's obviously a spectrum that you decide on how much cost to outlay. So should you just have security guards standing at entrances, or should you install cameras and everything right through the building, right? That would be the extreme end with security all around the building, as an example. Okay, now we're doing risk management process, right? So if you are a portfolio manager, right, and you assume that there's a risk attached to your building, there is a risk management process that you can take, and there are 5 steps. You need to know those 5 steps as well, that's examinable. You need to know the 5 steps in the risk management process. What steps will you take to control the risk, or to mitigate the risk, or to reduce losses, right? So the first step is identification. What exactly is your risk? What is the risk profile of the property? And you need to basically investigate all the hazards and the risks that can be identified, and establish what could possibly go wrong, and how it will happen, and how it will impact your building, right? That's the first step. The second step is measurement. So everything can be quantified, and this will have to be quantified, right? So it either can be a cost quantification or a volume quantification, it doesn't matter, it has to be measured, right? So that would include the determination of the following 3 things: the probability or the chance that the loss will occur, and the impact that the losses would have, and then also the ability to predict losses that will actually occur. So once you've identified your risk, you then need to go ahead and measure the actual risk that your building is now exposed to. Right, so now that you've got that, you go to the third step, which is you take control measures. And how do you do that, right? So you've already quantified your risk, now we're doing control measures, right? So the appropriate control measures selected will include the following items: avoiding the risk. Perhaps you can avoid the risk altogether. Let's say you foresee disruptions. What can you do to avoid the risk? Move the venue off-site, like we just did, right? Move the venue off-site, therefore not exposing your students to the risk, right? The second thing that you can do is reduce the chance that loss will occur, or reduce its magnitude, right? Do you need an example of that? So you either reduce the chance that the loss will occur, or reduce the magnitude. And then you transfer the risk to another party. How do you do that?
Insurance.
Insurance, exactly. That's what you're doing. You are transferring the risk. So you know there will be a risk. You know that there might be student disruptions, for example. You move that risk to the insurance, and the insurance will cover the cost associated with the vandalism, as an example. And then retaining or bearing the risk internally, right? That you bear the costs on yourself, right? You choose to move to another venue, you choose to bear the cost, and you move it off-site, but you bear the costs. That's internal, right? And then the benefits and the costs associated with alternative methods must be assessed, taking into consideration financial implications. Maybe you get a venue for free. Thank you, Jacques. Right? Or you have an overall policy relating to the risk management, and you also get specific objectives of the property owner. What does the property owner actually want? That needs to come into play. Do they want to have a cost outlay, or do they just want to reduce the risk? Where do they sit, basically? And then you adjust your policy accordingly. And then determine whether the changing conditions require different solutions. Right? So now you know how to control the risk. Now, what do? Implementation, that's your fourth step. The fourth step is after the decision's been made, we made our decision to move our venue off-site so as to not expose our students to risk. And now we implement. You actually set it up. You execute. You've made your decision, you execute, right? Which is what we did here. And then you monitor. Results of the decision made and implemented should be monitored to establish the effectiveness. Is this venue effective?
Yeah.
Certainly is working, right? So there we go. We actually went through each one of the 5 steps. We identified, we measured, we controlled it, then we went ahead and implemented all very quickly, and now we're monitoring. If my students are fine, then it was the correct steps that were taken, right? And then we determine whether the changing conditions require different solutions. So far it seems fine. We can actually carry on with that. Now, what risk control tools do property managers have at their disposal, right? The property manager can use risk control tools to alter the exposure to risk in such a way as to reduce the expected property, liability and personnel losses, right? So staff losses. And then also to make the annual loss experience more predictable. So for our next session, we can anticipate similar behavior, similar risk profile for our block sessions. So we will know, you know what, let's be safe, move it off-site. That's what you're doing. You're learning the lesson and you're implementing it for the future, right? And then also you need to know these 5 items. Risk control techniques include avoid, right? You avoid the risk altogether. Loss control, separation, combination, and the transfer of risk. That's just different ways that we can control the risk that we're exposed to, right? Then there's some definitions. You might have to know these definitions. You might have to match it up in an exam, who knows? But do know the definitions. Right. Risk control tools either reduce potential losses or they make it more predictable. Maybe you can't predict it altogether, but you've got a better idea of what to expect from your loss, right? And then risk funding tools, right? What is a risk funding tool? An example that would be used was the landlord transfer the risk to a tenant financial responsibility. Let's use the cost of water as an example, right? So either the landlord can bear the cost if the cost of water goes up, or you can alter your lease in such a way where, due to the current situation, we will now bill you accordingly and be fully reimbursed for your water usage. That's a way that the landlord will not be exposed to the high costs, escalating costs of water as an example. And then insurance, as you mentioned, Jacques, is the most important risk transfer mechanism, right? You're transferring it to a third party that will now, so you pay a cost for the risk to be transferred to a third party. Right. Then the property manager as a risk manager, right? So a property manager will also need to understand the risk profile of the building, and will need to understand what to expect. We'll need to be able to implement, this is the final bit, we'll need to be able to implement risk control mechanisms by going through those 5 steps, right? So this is what the role of a property manager would need to cover, right? So property managers typically not involved with speculative risks, right? So we don't gamble, right? You make informed decisions and you set a system in place. You don't make a speculative risk and develop a building if you've got no idea what's going to happen to it, right? Except with speculative risks can have an effect on pure risks, okay? So, but the property manager is involved with most pure risks associated with the property that he manages. Remember, the building can be exposed to a pure risk like a fire or a flood or a structural issue. Absolutely, right? So that's where the property manager now comes in, right? And he should be well versed in the application of risk management principles. Remember, we went through those risk management principles. And then the responsibilities typically include, these are very important, life safety. Put people, visitors, staff, personnel, tenants, their lives first. Environmental issues, minimize the impact that your building has on the environment. Insurance and security. You know, always have insurance in place, always have security in place. And there we go. That's pretty straightforward. Thank you. So now we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is chapter 2. We're still in session 1. Chapter 2, unit 6, delict and the property manager. Right. What is delict? Do we know what delict is?
No.
Right.
Delict is a legal term.
Yes.
That I know.
Yeah, okay, let's go through it.
What does it really mean?
Let's go through let's put the exact definition in it right now, right? So, first let me give you some introduction to it, right? In terms of the Constitution, right, every person has a right to a safe and healthy environment, right? So now we already know that the property manager has responsibilities. You can already assume that the person entering your building is going to have an impact, is going to have a right to be safe in our buildings. Let's actually start there.
Environment.
Yeah. So I'm the property manager. I've got a building.
Safety.
Whoever enters my building will now have a right to a healthy and safe environment. Okay. Right. Now, as you said, Jacques, according to legislation, which is a law made by Parliament, is the most important source of law as regards to health and safety at work. How do we do that? We put an act in place that obligates every property manager, right? You're under an obligation to keep your people safe, and that's how we control it, right? The common law requires an employer to take reasonable care for the health and safety of his employees and visitors to the property. If there's a conflict between the provision and the act and the common law, the act will always prevail. Remember, common law is less exact than the act. The act is something that's been passed in Parliament. It's every citizen is bound by the act, right? So common law might have a looser interpretation of how to go about it, right? So Act 85 of 1993, as amended, came into effect on the 1st of January 1994, right? So which act is this? It's the Occupational Health and Safety Act of South Africa, or for short, OHSA, right? It's a preventative legislation. So what does it do? It means that everybody is under obligation to prevent the personnel risk, right? So you're preventing them from, you're preventing them from being exposed to risk and being exposed to danger. It's a control measure. It details measures that it needs to be, I'm going to read this right out. It details measures that need to be taken to avoid accidents, right? As well as people who may be affected by activities of these working people and members to the public. So basically you are bound to make sure that everything in your building is in proper working condition. You're not going to expose your visitors to a broken escalator, as an example, right? Because that could become a criminal offense if you didn't take steps to prevent that, right? The Act imposes an obligation on the property manager to ensure as far as possible that persons other than those in his employment, such as visitors and tenants, who may be directly affected by his activities are not thereby exposed to the hazards to their health or safety, right? That makes sense. It is the responsibility of the property manager to ensure that the subcontractors comply with the requirements of the Act. So even though subcontractors are not in his direct employ, he's got a right to contractually hold them to also maintaining that same set of standards. Okay? Right. The Act also provides that a competent person be designated for premises in which machinery is used. Example, standby generator, right? You want somebody that actually knows what he's doing to be in charge of dangerous equipment, right? That's essentially what we're saying. And then non-compliance of the Act can be very serious. CEOs can be held personally liable for transgressions and can be fined a maximum of 1 million or 2 years of imprisonment or both. This is real. That's serious. It can be, it is enforced, in fact. So if I, as a landlord now, hires an incompetent property manager to oversee I didn't do the due diligence to ensure that they know what they're doing, and they fail to take the necessary steps, it can be escalated, and somebody will be held personally liable, especially if there's a loss of life or something like that, right? The next thing that you need to know is the scope of the Act, or basically how the structure of the Act is set up, right? So there's various levels or phases within the Act that will guide you as to what is applicable at what points, okay? Right, so the scope of the Act. The scope of the Act provides for safety, which is the prevention of accidents in the workplace, as well as occupational health, which is prevention of illnesses arising from employment. Okay? Now we're talking about the structure of the Act. This relates to 3 principles, right? And this you need to know, right? We're talking about the structure of the Act. The first principle is a general framework of duties and prohibitions. So the first principle is a general framework of duties and prohibitions, right? So the Act imposes a number of duties and prohibitions on both the employers and the employees. So the employer's duties can be divided into 2 categories, that you must also know: direct duties and cooperative duties. What is a direct duty? Direct duty of, let's say, the property manager is to train employees properly to take adequate precautionary measures. I'm the property manager. I've got a facilities or an operations manager working beneath me, and beneath the operations manager is perhaps an entry-level artisan that wants to be upskilled. It is my direct duty to ensure that the operation manager can also oversee the artisan, and he needs to be trained to properly take precautionary measures. So they need to be able to spot issues in the building already, right? And this is obviously escalated again. And then cooperative duties, right? What is an example of a cooperative duty, right? To implement worker representation with regard to health and safety matters and comply with the procedures of the independent policing functions of the Department of Labour. Somebody needs to ensure that everybody is abiding by the Act. That's essentially what we're saying. We are cooperating with what needs to be done. We're complying with what needs to be done, right? There are control measures in place. If I don't want to do it, there needs to be somebody that will check up against me and ensure that everybody's safety is in fact seen to. Right, now the second principle, the employer or employee cooperation and self-regulation. What does that mean? The promotion of health and safety is not just the responsibility of the employer and the employees, but health and safety representatives and safety committees are appointed. So if you think of a big commercial building, right, you've got perhaps you've got a facilities manager or property manager overseeing the building. Within that building, there could be a third-party representation. Have you seen those fire drills? Is actually people that occupy the building are actually put in charge of ensuring that those take place at regular times. Right? So I'm possibly a tenant in a big building. Maybe the landlord is not taking performing their duty. It can be a third party representation that says, listen here, this needs to be done. We need to keep somebody in check. We need to keep somebody accountable for these things. Right? That's what this second principle is saying. Then the third principle is the need for independent control and supervision. What does that mean? To provide compliance to the Act, like we said already, and provision is made for continuous policing done by an independent third party. And then this is done on 2 levels. The creation and empowerment of an inspectorate and provision for investigations and inquiries in case of accidents at work. So you'll already notice that Chapter 2, Delict and the Property Manager, which focuses completely on the Occupational Health and Safety Act, is purely understanding the legislation behind it. So there's a lot of theory, right? So just read, and it's pretty straightforward, right? Read and understand. Now, regulations and safety standards, right? So the Act provides that the Minister can make regulations prescribed by the Act. So the Act will then guide different regulations and standards to be put into place, right? And the most common one is the South African Bureau of Standards, right? You've all heard about that, right? So that would be more detailed, but now this is where it becomes interesting, right? It's applicable to health and safety regulations and can be subdivided into following categories. Regulations aimed at creating a healthy and safety working environment, and then regulations aimed at the safe performance of work incidental to most production processes. So what it then does is the Occupational Health and Safety Act guides, should I say, for different industries. There will be different regulations for different industries on how to behave, what to comply to, what checks and balances need to be placed, who would be accountable for what sort of issues. That's essentially what the act aims to do, right? So let's go with the first category, right? The first category, which we said was regulations aimed at creating a healthy and safety working environment. Let's go through some of them. Environmental regulations, example, thermal requirements, lighting, windows, ventilation. If you have a building, you must have ventilation. It's as simple as that. You cannot decide to put up a building without ventilation if people are going to work in the building, right? That's an example. Facilities regulations such as sanitation, availability of drinking water, conditions of the facilities, example, right? Remember when we were doing maintenance in the last block session, we said that there were 4 levels of implementation of maintenance programs, and the lowest level was where we said it was often at an executive's whim that things were decided, and then we said that there were different control measures in place. The highest control measure is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So that then ensures that somebody somewhere will be accountable to ensure that there's compliance. That's essentially what we're saying. Right. And then regulations aimed at the safe performance of work incidental to most production processes. General safety regulations, example, first aid, emergency equipment and procedures, right? And then machinery regulations provide for the regulation of machinery in general, right? So let's say I'm a property manager of a C-grade building and I don't want to put lots of funds into it. I can say I don't want to paint the outside because there might be lower compliance regulations for that. But I certainly need to make sure that the lift is properly and fully functional. And how do they do that? There's procedures and regulations in place that this sort of lift will be serviced once every 6 months, as an example, right? There is a regulation that will guide me, and if I don't do it, I can be held accountable for not ensuring compliance. Now we're talking about delict, right? What is the basic rule of delict? A delict, and this definition is important again, a delict is a breach of duty imposed by law. So the law says something, I am not doing it. I am therefore in delict. Okay? A delict is a breach of duty imposed by the law, which could be grounds for damages of any person to whom the duty was owed and who has suffered harm in consequence of the breach. Does that make sense? It's a civil wrong. I'm held accountable by law to do something. I did not do it. I'm therefore accountable because somebody somewhere got hurt. That's what's happening. That step that I said doesn't need to be fixed. The building wasn't compliant with the Occupational Health and Safety Act. That put somebody at risk. Therefore, I am in breach of the law. That's really what we're saying. So the definition as it stands is important. A delict is a breach of duty imposed by the law, which could be grounds for damage of any person to whom the duty was owed. Who was the duty owed to? Anybody entering my building? A visitor, a tenant, right?
A worker.
Employee, yeah, absolutely. That is who the duty was owed to. And who has suffered harm, the person fell down the steps, right? In consequence of the breach. It was a civil wrong. It was wrong of me to not fix it. Somebody got hurt. That's really what we say. Now, delict and breach of contract, this is where it becomes interesting, right? A breach of contract is also wrongful but arises from a contractual obligation, right? So this is I'm now bound by my contract to ensure certain things must be done, right? Some wrongs can be both. It can be, let's use the example, a builder who is negligently fails to strengthen the foundations in terms of a building contract, resulting in the collapse or the structural injury to the occupants, right? So there was delict there and breach of contract. His contract with the landlord said that he had to set it up in a certain way, and he did not, and he's in breach of the law. So he's in breach of his contract, and he is in breach of the law. Must I go through that again? Right? So you can be held accountable on 2 different fronts. Contract and the law. Contract is with the landlord or with whoever signed the contract, and the law is he was bound by the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Okay. And then there's commission and omission. This you all need to understand as well. I'm going to go through it now. Delictual responsibility can either arise by either commission or omission. Omission is to act restrictively. Omission to act more restrictively is applied. Okay, what does that mean? They actually don't give the definitions here. The definition is in your textbook. Okay, let's go on. The control of dangerous object, right? What is a dangerous object? In property management, in a specific circumstance, a person has a legal duty to act positively to control a dangerous situation. And this is the example of the broken stairway example. Again, the dangerous object. You need to be able to identify the dangerous object. Awareness. Whether an owner or occupier should be aware of a dangerous situation. And then also the test is applied to determine negligence is what steps the reasonable person would have taken in the circumstances. Why is this part important? Remember, let's go back to our property manager who's got the operation manager working for them, and then below the operations manager, let's say we've got an artisan. So the property manager might be aware of certain issues. That looks like a dangerous thing, that looks like it needs to be fixed, that service is due for the lift and so on, right? Because he's aware of those things, right? But now can we expect the artisan who's just an entry-level person to be aware of the same? Will a reasonable person, that's where we apply the test now. You're saying no, but will a reasonable person look at the step and see that it's broken and think that is actually in fact a risk? Exactly. Reasonable person test. And then also remember that we were under obligation to make sure that our staff is trained properly. And we did not do so. And that's where we escalate the issue now. Somebody will be held responsible for that person falling down the stairs. That's really what we're saying. Okay, now what's a potentially dangerous situation? The owner or occupier, control of the property, has a legal duty to ensure that there's no potential dangerous situations. It will come back, somebody will be accountable somewhere. Okay, now we're dealing with, again, deleting the property manager. You need to know the difference between common law obligations and then obligations in terms of the act. Okay? What is common law obligations? These are important here, right? And here we're just listing the common law obligations. Lateral support, damage caused to neighboring properties, nuisances, encroachments, contributing negligence, and causation. That's on page 18 and 19. So in the PowerPoint slides, we're just mentioning it, but you need to know the difference. I can go through them with you. Yeah, we've still got a few minutes, right? Lateral support. You've got a duty, a common law obligation to your neighbor to ensure that your property is supported properly with lateral support, right? Shall I go through it? The definitions are all there. Okay, right? Nuisances, right? As an example, perhaps I've got a lot of cats. The cats could be a nuisance. Sound. Remember in industrial property management, back in Unit 3, Unit 2, we spoke about industrial properties, right? What sort of things are nuisances, right? Sounds, perhaps, light emissions and so on, that's also a nuisance. And then we go down to damages. The object of awarding damages is to place the injured party in the position he would have been, he would have enjoyed had the delict not occurred. So the person fell down the steps. What obligation do we now have to them? To ensure that he's in a position that he would have been in had the incident not occurred. So basically, maybe we can pay his hospital bill, right? As an example. Okay, you broke your shoe, sure, we'll replace your shoes. No, that's a small example. And that would include pain, suffering and the loss of income and the future loss of income. Perhaps he is in hospital for 3 months and he isn't covered for sick leave or something, right? We would then pay that income for that duration that he's unemployed. And then dependence of the person, especially with fatal injuries, can also claim.
What is lateral support?
Lateral support is ground support. So you can't decide to build a pool. Let's say you've got 2 neighboring properties, right? You can't decide to build a pool right at in the corner of your property because now you're digging down into the earth, right? So sure, you're still within your
Boundaries.
boundaries, but you extracting earth deep down will cause the lateral support to be compromised, essentially. That's really what you're doing. You can't decide to dig for.
But that is why there's municipal laws, not 3 meters
Exactly.
on the
Building
building
lines.
lines.
Exactly. It's exactly it. Yeah. Exactly it.
So as die buurman se grensmuur omval en hy val op sy teen, jy betaal.
Okay, and then very, very quickly. Okay. I'm not going to go through this because this is just definitions. We need to go on to the next chapter very quickly. These are just definitions. You must know what exclusionary clauses are. Prescription for remedies. Basically, something happened as a result of property manager delect. How do you remedy the situation? Right? This is just taking that a step further. Something went wrong. What do you do to fix it? That's a prescription of remedies. And then vicarious liability as well. Okay? That's just the definition that you must know. The prescription of remedies, again, like we said. What exactly must the property manager do to put them in a position had the incident not occurred? And there we go. That is all it. Very quickly, let's go on to chapter 3. This is a nice straightforward chapter. Now we're talking about fire prevention and control. Remember, this would be an example of pure risk. Nothing good can come out of it, right? Right. So fire is an ever-present hazard in buildings. We know this. Management should formulate a clearly defined policy taking into account the following 4 things, right? Municipal fire regulations, the degree of liability as regards the fire, and then the nature of loss that the fire can cause, and the implementation of fire preventative systems. Again, the responsibility would then lie with the property manager to ensure that these policies are in place to ensure in case of a fire. There's 4 objectives for fire safety. Number 1, very important, life safety. And then number 2, the protection of the contents of a building, right? The protection of the building fabric and the minimization of threat to the environment. Those 4 things are important, right? So agencies that control the adequacy of the fire safety design for these objectives are, who are these people? The local fire authority, right? Insurance companies and local or national authorities. Those 3 people or those 3 parties can assist with also with fire prevention policies, right? The fire safety systems needs to minimize the fire threat in a building, may be the same for each of the objectives, but the level of performance of the system is not likely to be the same for the system to make a contribution to each objective, right? That's very wordy. Basically, what it's saying is, in a building, you need to have a fire system that can minimize the fire threat, and it's not likely to be the same for each objective, right? I'll give you an example in a minute, right? So right now we're talking about design. How do we go about preventing, putting in place fire preventative measures, right? The building design. You know what a fire door is, right? So you can't. A modern building and equipment designed in accordance with demanding fire prevention codes, right? So you have to have fire exits, right? That's an important feature of a building. You have to have fire doors. What's a fire door? A fire door, you put it in certain strategic places that will prevent the fire from moving to the next area. So you're controlling the risk. You're controlling or minimizing the impact that it would have. Maintenance. Maintain the fire equipment. You maintain the sprinkler system overhead. Ensure that absolutely we're making sure that fire extinguishers are serviced all the time. Liaison with the fire department. You need to have regular inspections to ensure that the fire department comes at regular times to inspect your building. And then good housekeeping prevents fires. So obviously you can't have a big recycling depot at the back of your building that with all these flammable objects and so on, right? Training preparedness, right? The appropriate degree of training will vary according to the type and size of the buildings, right? So high-priced buildings are generally quite safe, and the vast majority of fire fatalities occur in private detached dwellings, right? There's less of a requirement, right? There's a lot more accountability with big buildings. they're going to put more measures in place, right? Office buildings which are well populated during the day, fire detection is easy, and training and communication with tenants to emphasize the need for prompt action. It's much more likely to spot an issue in a much more populated building, essentially, right? At night, office buildings are depopulated, which lessens the risk of fire and injury, right? In a building, in a residential building, for example, at night, that's when the people are sleeping, so there's a lower chance of them detecting the issue. That's what we're saying. And then there's floor wardens and monitors with audio-visual presentations, right? People can pick these things up. In apartment blocks, relatively safe. Why? Because it's solidly built with masonry or concrete dividing walls, and the fire is likely to be localized for longer within an apartment, right? Because of the setup and the high amount of buildings, you're going to have more fire doors in place. You're going to have more fire exits in place. You're going to have more fire prevention systems in place, right? With a shifting population, it's unfeasible to undertake fire drill instructions, right? So instead, you have clear signposting and instructions on fire stairs and lifts and lobbies. In buildings, you'll see assembly point signs and notices all over the building, right? And then theft and vandalism to firefighting apparatus. How do you prevent that? With locked cabinets with glass fronts. You know, break in the event of a fire, right? So somebody can't just go ahead and steal the fire equipment. And then you have the fire risk in factories and warehouses, varies according to the natures of goods stored and on the processes undertaken in such buildings. Shopping centres, very important. Shopping centres should not present great fire hazards if it's well designed and if housekeeping is good. So in broad malls, you have lots of exit points, we said, and the ground floor is just one up or down. It's not, you don't get a very high-rise shopping centre, right? Fire drills are not normally feasible. You don't disrupt the shopping activity of your customers, so you don't have a fire drill. So what do? At night, you take the building staff and tenants that volunteer, and you go through the fire drill process, right? And it's also reliant on the manager's ability to communicate and evacuate in a crisis. One person is accountable. One person is going to ensure that the entire building is evacuated. You must have good communication channels in place already prior to these emergencies. And then special attention to securing shop premises during the evacuation to forestall looting attempts. Right? Everybody must know what to do in case of a fire. Lock up, leave everything, go. Again, training preparedness. The materials of which modern structures are constructed are usually fire resistant. Management must be vigilant to ensure that fire hazards are not introduced by tenants, such as masses of loose waste paper normally constitute a fire hazard. Curtains and upholstery, I'm not going to read through everything. It's basically very straightforward. Okay? And then this is a nice type of question, right? This is an example of a question that could come in an exam, right? How would you, as a property manager, prepare for the evacuation of people from a building? These are the different steps that you take, right? Let's just jump quickly to here. In public buildings, evacuation can be initiated by well-trained staff. You put systems in place before the fire drill needs to take place, right? You deploy enough staff to cover the areas. You have voice communication systems and CCTVs. And then obviously you need to ensure people's safety in public buildings. And in the best way, effective evacuation procedures. I'm just going to jump straight to the important points. Effective evacuation procedures, you need to have regular staff training, effective communication among staff. It's all very straightforward and practical steps that you need to take. And then as well as provide truthful and precise information to building occupants during a fire emergency. Right? Be open and honest about the size of the risk. Elements for safety, fire safety to be assessed. That's a good table to know. I'm not going to go through everything. And then this is how to compile a fire checklist for a building. This is the duty of the property manager, and also needs to be checked by the portfolio manager and so on. And that is about it. That's just a fire checklist. That's all. Okay. Questions? Right, we've got time for questions.